A grandmother in Burkina Faso sits on a wooden stool outside her small home. Her hands are rough from years of farming, but today they tremble as she clasps them together in prayer. She is not praying for wealth or comfort. She is praying that her grandchildren can walk to school without fear of being kidnapped or killed. For her, this is the true meaning of freedom, a day when her family can live without terror. This simple, human longing captures the soul of a nation that has endured years of violence, hunger, and despair. Burkina Faso, a country of just over 22 million people, has suffered one of the highest levels of extremist violence in all of Africa. Armed groups once controlled more than two-thirds of the country's land, leaving over 2 million people displaced from their homes. Villages were burned, markets destroyed, and roads turned into death traps. For many families, survival meant fleeing at night with only the clothes on their backs. It seemed impossible that any leader could reverse such devastation. Yet in 2023, something extraordinary happened. A young officer named Ibrahim Traoré rose to power and vowed to reclaim Burkina Faso's dignity. Against all odds, he launched a campaign that pushed terrorists out of vast swathes of territory. By the end of the year, 72.7% of previously lost land had been taken back. To the outside world, this may sound like another number on a map. But for families like the grandmother in her village, it meant the return of hope. It meant children laughing again on dusty roads, farmers returning to their fields, and churches and mosques reopening their doors. This is not just a story about Burkina Faso. It is a story about courage, sacrifice, and the fight for security in a world where powerful interests often ignore the struggles of ordinary people. As you listen, think about what this fight really means, not only for Africa, but for all of us. If you believe that every family deserves safety, every nation deserves dignity, and every child deserves a future, then stay with us. Because the journey of Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré is more than breaking news, it is a lesson in what it means to defend freedom when the world is watching. Before we continue, take a moment to ask yourself, what would it mean if this were your family, your town, your country? Would you stand behind a leader who risked everything to protect your home? Share your reflections, because your perspective matters in this global conversation about justice, security, and the destiny of nations. When Ibrahim Traoré took command of Burkina Faso, he inherited a nation on the edge of collapse. More than two-thirds of the country had fallen under the control of terrorist groups. Roads that once carried goods and families were too dangerous to travel. Schools sat empty, their chalkboards covered in dust, because parents feared sending children out of their sight. Hospitals struggled with shortages, not just of medicine, but of patients themselves. Too many villages had been abandoned. To most outsiders, Burkina Faso was a failed state waiting for foreign intervention. Yet Traoré refused to wait for help. He made a decision that startled the world. Burkina Faso would fight for its survival alone. The campaign began with a call to arms, not only for soldiers, but for citizens. Farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, ordinary men and women were asked to defend their communities. Within weeks, nearly 50,000 civilian volunteers were trained and armed to join the fight alongside the army. For a nation that had been told for years that it was too weak, this surge of unity was unprecedented. Weapons came from military stockpiles and captured caches. AK-47 rifles, light machine guns, and rocket-propelled grenades once used by militants now turned against them. It was not sophisticated, but it was enough. The results were astonishing. By late 2023, Burkina Faso's forces had recaptured 72.7% of territory that had been lost. Over 1,000 villages that had been ghost towns began to show signs of life. Farmers returned to plant sorghum and millet. Children walked to reopen schools, sometimes escorted by soldiers but free of fear for the first time in years. In markets once closed by violence, women laid out baskets of tomatoes, peanuts, and shea butter, whispering prayers of gratitude that business could resume. Behind the statistics were personal stories that gave flesh to the numbers. In the northern town of Djibo, once under siege for months, a young boy named Adama spoke to reporters after soldiers broke the blockade. His family had survived on little more than dried leaves and dirty water. "I thought I would die here," he said. "Now I want to go back to school." For Adama and thousands like him, Traoré's campaign was not abstract politics. It was the difference between life and death, despair and possibility. But victories came at a cost. More than 2,000 soldiers and volunteers gave their lives in the counteroffensive. Their funerals were simple, marked by drums, hymns, and lines of mourners stretching through the streets. Ibrahim Traoré attended many of them in person, often standing silently with families, offering no speeches, only presence. It was in these moments that the people saw not just a military commander, but a man willing to shoulder their pain. Critics abroad argued that Traoré's reliance on volunteers risked chaos, that arming civilians would sow disorder in the future. Yet on the ground, the reality was different. Communities felt empowered for the first time in decades. An elderly farmer named Musa, who had once fled after militants torched his fields, returned with a rifle slung across his back. "This land is ours," he declared. "No one will take it again." His words echoed across the Sahel, a new determination that Africans themselves could be the guardians of their soil. International observers were caught off guard. Western governments had assumed that without NATO or UN support, Burkina Faso would crumble. Instead, it stood. France, the former colonial power, withdrew its troops after being told they were no longer welcome. The message was clear. Burkina Faso would no longer be dictated to by outsiders. In the capital, crowds marched with signs reading, "Our land, our fight, our victory." For many older citizens who had lived through decades of foreign influence, the pride was overwhelming. The scale of displacement also began to shift. More than 500,000 internally displaced people started to return home, though challenges remained. Some villages were so destroyed they had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Humanitarian agencies noted that while security was improving, food shortages and medical needs were still dire. Yet the sense of hope, fragile though it was, had returned. A grandmother named Awa, who had spent 2 years living in a crowded camp, finally took her grandchildren back to their ancestral home. She stood in the ruins of her old kitchen and said, "Even if the roof is gone, at least we are free." Still, many questions lingered. How had a small, underfunded army, backed by hastily trained volunteers, managed to achieve what global powers had failed to do in Afghanistan or Iraq? Analysts pointed to several factors: local knowledge of the terrain, strong morale rooted in defending one's own home, and a leader who spoke plainly to his people about sacrifice. Unlike politicians in suits far away, Traoré wore a military uniform and addressed citizens as comrades in a shared struggle. His speeches were not polished, but they resonated. He told them, "We will live free, or we will die together." For a weary population, those words meant everything. Yet beneath the celebrations, darker undercurrents stirred. Taking back land was one thing. Holding it, rebuilding it, and protecting it from new waves of attack was another. Militants were weakened, not eliminated. Neighboring countries remained unstable, and foreign corporations whose profits were threatened were unlikely to remain silent. Even as the government celebrated, whispers of retaliation, political, economic, even military, spread across the region. Burkina Faso had shocked the world by reclaiming its land. But could it keep it? Could Ibrahim Traoré, so young and untested, withstand the pressures of both terrorism and international power politics? Or would the victory unravel under the weight of forces far larger than his nation? And so the question remains. This triumph may have restored dignity for millions, but what hidden challenges are waiting just beyond the horizon? As you reflect on this moment, ask yourself, if an underdog nation like Burkina Faso can fight back against overwhelming odds, What does it teach us about resilience, justice, and the value of family and community? If this story stirs something in you, don't just listen passively. Share your perspective. Speak out, because the voices of ordinary people, whether in Africa or America, are what truly shape the destiny of nations. The turning point came not on the battlefield, but in the capital itself. In Ouagadougou, under the hot West African sun, Ibrahim Traoré announced a decision that shook both his country and the wider world. He ordered the arrest of several executives from foreign mining corporations, men who for decades had enjoyed unchecked power, extracting gold and uranium while local communities remained in poverty. On a single morning, in one coordinated move, these powerful figures were taken into custody by Burkinabé's security forces. The image of wealthy foreign businessmen, once untouchable, now being led away in handcuffs, spread like wildfire across Africa. For many in Burkina Faso, it was the moment they realized that their leader was not just fighting terrorists in the bush. He was willing to confront the deeper structures of exploitation. Crowds poured into the streets. In the city center, thousands of citizens gathered with flags, banners, and portraits of Traoré. Mothers carried children on their backs, chanting his name. Young men climbed onto rooftops, shouting, "Our land, our future." Old veterans of past struggles wiped tears from their eyes. For the first time in years, there was not just relief, but pride. A collective sense that dignity had been restored. "We are no longer slaves in our own country," shouted an elderly man named Yakuba, a former miner who had once worked under harsh conditions for one of the same companies whose leaders were now behind bars. Inside government buildings, the mood was tense. Advisors warned Traoré that this bold move would provoke international backlash. Diplomats from Western nations demanded explanations, hinting at sanctions and frozen aid. In contrast, messages of support arrived from ordinary Africans across the continent. Letters, videos, and calls praising Burkina Faso for standing up against global exploitation. Even in neighboring Mali and Niger, demonstrations broke out in solidarity, with citizens holding signs that read, "Traoré is Africa's voice." The domestic military leadership also faced a critical test. Some feared that confronting powerful international corporations would stretch the country's fragile resources even further. Yet, in a symbolic act of unity, senior generals stood beside Traoré at a national press conference. In military fatigues, they declared, "This fight is not just about land. It is about our sovereignty, our future, and the future of our children." Cameras captured the moment, broadcasting it across Africa and beyond. For many watching, it felt like a declaration of independence all over again. On the ground, the people's reactions were even more visceral. In the mining town of Houndé, workers who had long endured unsafe conditions celebrated by marching through the dusty streets. A group of women sang traditional songs of victory, their voices carrying through the air like a collective hymn. One young miner named Issouf told a journalist, "My father died in a mine collapse while foreigners made millions. Today, for the first time, I believe justice is possible." His words resonated with audiences far beyond Burkina Faso, echoing the frustrations of countless communities across Africa. International media scrambled to respond. Some Western outlets portrayed Traoré as reckless, accusing him of driving away investment and risking further isolation. Others, especially in Africa and parts of the global south, hailed him as a symbol of resistance. Social media platforms lit up with hashtags celebrating his name, and debates raged over whether his leadership represented a dangerous gamble or the beginning of a new African era. The climax of this chapter was not just in the arrests or the marches. It was in the feeling that history itself was shifting. For decades, African leaders had bowed to external powers. Now, a 30-something soldier in Burkina Faso had dared to challenge them openly. That act electrified the continent, but it also painted a target on his back. Everyone knew that powerful interests, from governments to corporations, would not let such defiance go unanswered, and so the question lingers. With the world watching and the stakes higher than ever, will the international community move swiftly to punish Burkina Faso, or will they be too late to stop a movement that has already taken root? As you think about this moment, consider how you would react if your own nation stood up against decades of exploitation. Would you feel pride, fear, or both? If the people of Burkina Faso can find the courage to challenge forces far greater than themselves, what does that say about the power of unity and belief in justice? Share your perspective, because it is only through honest voices, whether in Africa, America, or anywhere else, that history's turning points gain their true meaning. The victories on the battlefield and the bold arrests in the capital did not erase the suffering that ordinary Burkinabé citizens had endured. In many parts of the country, families were only beginning to return after years of exile. The scars of displacement ran deep. More than 2 million people had fled their homes during the height of the insurgency, and although more than 500,000 were able to return, countless others remained in crowded camps. These camps, scattered across the countryside, were filled with makeshift tents, long lines for water, and the smell of cooked millet stretching through the night air. For families who had lived like this for years, going back home was both a dream and a challenge. One of those families belonged to Mariam, a mother of 4. She had left her village in the east when militants burned her house to the ground. For 2 years, she lived in a camp outside Ouagadougou, sharing a small tent with her children. When soldiers finally secured her village, she returned to find nothing but ashes and the remains of what was once her kitchen. Yet Mariam's face carried both tears and determination. "Even if I must rebuild brick by brick, I will not leave again," she said. Her story mirrored that of thousands of families, hopeful but burdened with the heavy task of reconstruction. Politically, the impact was just as complex. Ibrahim Traoré had gained immense popularity among ordinary citizens, but the country's elite and opposition figures began to raise concerns. Some accused him of consolidating too much power, pointing to his reliance on the military and civilian volunteer groups. Others worried that his open defiance of foreign powers would invite economic sanctions or worse. In the parliament and in whispered circles of the capital, debates raged about whether Traoré was a savior or a risk to the nation's fragile democracy. Meanwhile, neighboring countries watched closely. Mali and Niger expressed support, seeing in Traoré's actions a reflection of their own struggles. But in coastal states like Ghana and Ivory Coast, leaders feared that the surge of popular anti-Western sentiment could spill over their borders. Regional alliances were strained, and the African Union faced pressure to either condemn or embrace Burkina Faso's new direction. The sense of uncertainty grew as the political chessboard shifted almost daily. For ordinary people, however, the focus remained on survival. Farmers worked to replant crops in fields that had been left fallow for years. Teachers returned to classrooms, sometimes writing on cracked chalkboards under roofs patched with plastic sheeting. Children laughed again in schoolyards, though many carried memories of loss. Friends and relatives who had not survived the violence. Churches and mosques held services filled with gratitude, but also with prayers for lasting peace. The economic challenges were immense. With foreign corporations threatened and some pulling out of the country, jobs and investments were at risk. At the same time, there was a surge in local pride, with communities discussing how to manage resources on their own terms. Small cooperatives formed in mining towns, where workers pledged to share profits fairly instead of sending them abroad. It was an experiment in economic independence, fragile but inspiring. Yet, the social consequences could not be ignored. Families were divided, with some members returning to villages, while others stayed in camps or fled abroad. In some cases, young men who had taken up arms as civilian volunteers now struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. Psychologists warned of the trauma carried by children who had grown up under constant threat. The nation had won back its land, but rebuilding its soul would take years, perhaps decades. Traoré himself walked a fine line. His speeches remained direct, reminding the people that sacrifices were still necessary. "Freedom is not won in a day," he told a crowd in Ouagadougou. "It is built every morning we rise, and every evening we stand guard over our families." These words resonated deeply with older citizens who understood that victories on the battlefield did not immediately translate into peace at home. But as Burkina Faso tried to rebuild, the looming question remained. Would the United States and its allies accept this new path? Or would they move to crush it before it could fully take root? As you consider these consequences, place yourself in the shoes of a family forced to choose between staying in a refugee camp or returning to a destroyed village. Would you have the strength to rebuild from nothing? These are not abstract questions. They are the daily realities of Burkina Faso's people. Share your thoughts, because by reflecting on their struggle, we remind ourselves of the values of justice, family, and dignity that bind us all together. The international response to Burkina Faso's dramatic turnaround was swift and divided. In European capitals, officials expressed alarm at Ibrahim Traoré's defiance. France, once the dominant power in the region, denounced his government's expulsion of French troops and warned of consequences for foreign investment. Sanctions were quietly discussed, and media outlets in Paris painted Traoré as a dangerous populist. Yet, on the streets of Ouagadougou, ordinary citizens waved banners declaring, "No more colonial masters," signaling that the break with France was more than symbolic. It was emotional, rooted in decades of frustration. Russia, on the other hand, seized the opportunity to embrace Burkina Faso. Russian state media praised Traoré as a brave young leader standing up to Western exploitation. Military cooperation talks began to surface, with rumors of training and equipment support. For Moscow, the Sahel was becoming another stage in its global contest with the West. For Washington, this was a red flag. In the United States, policymakers debated how to interpret Traoré's rise. Some in Congress argued that Burkina Faso's rejection of Western aid and partnerships threatened stability in the Sahel, a region critical to counter-terrorism operations. American intelligence reports warned that extremist groups, though weakened, were still active and could regroup. The Pentagon viewed the loss of access to Burkinabé territory as a setback for regional security efforts. If Burkina Faso drifts fully into Russia's orbit, one defense analyst noted, it will complicate U.S. strategy not only in Africa but globally. At the same time, there were voices within the U.S. calling for caution. Human rights groups urged Washington to recognize the legitimate grievances of the Burkinabé people. They argued that for too long, Western policy had focused narrowly on counterterrorism, while ignoring poverty, corruption, and the exploitation of resources. To many observers, Traoré's popularity was not about ideology, but about dignity, the chance for Burkinabé families to decide their own future. Globally, reactions ranged from admiration to fear. In Africa, movements in Mali, Niger, and beyond looked to Burkina Faso as proof that small nations could resist outside control. But in Western boardrooms, investors fretted about the precedent. If Burkina Faso could nationalize or disrupt foreign operations, what would stop other African nations from doing the same? And so the world faces a choice. Will the United States and its allies engage with Burkina Faso as a partner seeking independence, or will they treat it as a threat to be contained? Could this be the beginning of a wider crisis that reshapes Africa's role in global politics? Think carefully about this moment. If you were responsible for America's security, would you see Traoré as a danger or as an ally in disguise? Share your reflections, because how we interpret Burkina Faso's bold stand today may determine whether tomorrow brings greater peace or greater conflict. Burkina Faso's dramatic stand has captured the attention of the world, but it also comes with heavy risks. The Sahel remains one of the most fragile regions on Earth, where porous borders, weak economies, and extremist networks can turn victories into setbacks overnight. Even as villages are being rebuilt and families are returning home, there is the looming danger that instability could spread across the region. If the fragile alliances among African states do not strengthen in the coming months, Burkina Faso could find itself standing alone, vulnerable to both terrorist resurgence and international pressure. The warning signs are already visible. Armed groups that once controlled vast stretches of the countryside are retreating, but not disappearing. They wait in the shadows, ready to exploit any weakness. Meanwhile, powerful foreign corporations and governments watch with growing unease as their interests are challenged. History teaches us that nations which defy global powers rarely do so without consequence. For older Americans who lived through the Cold War, the echoes are unmistakable. A small nation daring to resist giants, caught in a game of survival where one wrong move could invite intervention. So the question hangs in the air. Is Ibrahim Traoré truly the hope of Africa? Or is he a spark that could ignite greater conflict? Is he the man who will secure a safer future for millions of Burkinabé citizens? Or the leader who will draw his country into a storm it cannot weather? Let us consider a sharp possibility. If within the next 3 months the African military alliances do not consolidate, Burkina Faso may face the grave risk of outside interference, economic, political, or even military. Such an outcome would not only destabilize one nation, but could trigger a chain reaction across the Sahel, threatening the fragile security of the entire continent. This is why the world must pay attention, not tomorrow, but today. If this story has stirred something within you, pause and reflect. Ask yourself, what does justice mean in our world today? If you believe that families everywhere deserve safety, that dignity should never be stolen by violence or exploitation, then carry that conviction forward. Share your thoughts, your prayers, and your voice. Because history is not written by the powerful alone. It is shaped by ordinary people who choose to speak when silence is easier. We will meet again in the next chapter of this unfolding story, where truth will continue to rise. May God bless Africa, the land of resilience, hope, and unbreakable will.